But unfortunately, the issue of race, if we understand it, is a lot more insidious. And it takes a lot more of a historical view to understand the difference between individual bias and structural racism and privilege. And the idea of Great Britain was intimately tied to the fact that Britain's invaded almost every country on the earth, literally.
Following on from the intellectually stunted race disparity report.
I'm not surprised about this. I basically left when I saw this, but because it's so absurd and ridiculous. The point of this report was not to genuinely get into these issues. It was to, they got a bunch of institutional racism deniers to deny institutional racism. And that's
institutional racism deniers.
Are we clinging on to a fairy tale in order to exclude all the faces of Britain and its colonies and their contributions?
Challenges traditional liberal thinking and suggests that white people benefit from structural advantages.
In order of the purpose of maintaining deference to the ruling classes.
Is not this simpler? Is this not your natural state?
Let's take a look.
Break it down!
If this report had intended to help address racism in Britain, it must surely be written off as a massive fail. However, many have questioned that if it was ever the objective in the first place.
You know, what we're saying is that it isn't, I mean, notions of institutional racism isn't really the key element.
This report minimises and denies the existence of deliberate institutional racism.
You found no evidence of institutional racism, and what I wonder is, are you saying you don't think that the institutions of the British state are in any way racist?
Let's face it, this was produced by a Tory party and their collaborators.
It does feel that this conversation has only just started. Surely it shouldn't be shut down.
It's not granular enough. We were asked to come up with public policy statements based on an understanding of the causes of disparities, which is what we did.
Who have rejected the concept of institutional racism many years before they began work on this report.
His head of policy, Munira Mirza, set it up, having previously suggested that structural racism is a perception more than a reality.
But more worrying, though, in this report was the reference to the slave period.
The report also challenges thinking by suggesting that slavery needs to be taught within a wider context. It says there is a new story about the Caribbean experience, which speaks to the slave period, not only being about profit and suffering, but how culturally African people transform themselves into a remodelled African Britain.
And with coded phrases and bizarre constructions used to describe this.
That's it, it's institutional racism. If we can get over that phrasing.
Dr. Sewell argues that,
white man, let me say that I love you, honor you, envy you, enjoy your smell, and I celebrate you in the name of white Jesus.
Thank you.
The story of the Caribbean experience was not only about profit and suffering.
Now, if you think niggas is worthless and lazy today, oh, Lord help me, you should have seen them back in slavery days. Good old Master Colonel and plantation owners like him provided darkies all over the South with good jobs, food, housing. I'm telling you, slavery was the best thing that ever could happen to Negro kind.
Which seems naive and just tone deaf, because of course it wasn't just about that.
The place of black people in British history is sometimes thought of as a story that begins with the arrival of the Windrush.
Because every reputable historian on slavery writes about Britain's centuries of slave trading and slave owning as a history of resistance and resilience, where the people trafficked from their homelands and born into bondage, created new cultures, identities and art forms, while being dehumanized and commodified.
That's a bit inconvenient.
It's only these paid bootlickers that describe it as well-intentioned benevolence from Britain's ruling classes.
These traditions have often been persecuted and even labelled anti-British or anti-state, until they bear fruit that the state then wants to claim for itself.
So this report is part of a tenuous argument that is determined to privilege comforting national myths, above hard historical truths. You know that black people are ungrateful and they don't appreciate that the luxury that their former bondage has granted them.
Yeah, this report shows many issues that we could address if we follow the advice in it, then we'd become a better society. We've already made a massive amount of progress over the last 50 years in comparison to the rest of Europe and the rest of the world, to be honest, in this area. We should celebrate that success and move forward with it.
Why can't we just be more English?
What are you doing here? Well, we British love to come down to our local for a pint.
They are entirely correct, though.
And the story of the black presence in the United Kingdom goes back all the way to Roman times.
As a new story is exactly what historians are disentombing from beneath a mountain of denialism.
Because we're not telling key moments in British history, whole aspects of the story of Britain are simply being left out of the picture.
That white saviour complex.
And what you don't learn about are the forces that led Britain to interact with Africa.
Which focuses on abolition and white abolitionist forces.
You don't learn about just how important the sugar slavery economy was in the 17th and 18th and early 19th centuries.
Or the cosy myths of civilizing the world.
These traditions don't fit the elite's message that they alone are responsible for everything that's good in society.
But remember, no power was ever handed over or exchanged peacefully. Nor was it its people knowingly selling out the future generations in a way to profit the eventual or eventually empower those forces. White man's burden and all that.
The white man's burden to go and civilize all these stupid brown folks that have been writing and having civilizations for thousands of years. But let's forget all of that.
This is that William Wilberforce-centric history that characterized enslaved people only as victims.
There are people who would rather deny the facts than confront the quite simple, uncontroversial, in my view, reality.
Not the apparent whinging of black and brown people expressing their experiential and truth claims, as we are so often told.
Rich white people telling working class and poor white people that their problem are black and brown people. So beginning in the 1600s, that is what happens.
Also, it suggested that becoming culturally British, whatever that means.
Many things have apparently come to define British values. Winston Churchill, the monarchy, empire, received pronunciation, aristocracy, whiteness.
Yeah, the system exploited our labours for over 300 years. That they then reaped all the rewards from with the subsequent abolition of slavery and compensation.
At school, I was taught about the act of abolition, that Britain freed the slaves. What I wasn't told was that Britain also compensated the slave owners to the tune £20 million. Now that's around £17 billion today.
Now, this mythos is important to the ruling classes and their financial interests to maintain our beloved servitude to deference.
Actually love his slavery. I mean, I think this is the danger, that actually people may be in some ways happy under the new regime, but they will be happy in a situation where they oughtn't to be happy.
And what I mean by this is the long history of suffrage amongst the masses of the UK throughout the centuries.
Therefore, it's no surprise that most of us learn more at school about Henry VIII's marital dramas than we do about the Peterloo Massacre.
Has largely been omitted from modernity.
These are the traditions embodied by striking miners, peasants revolting against private tyranny, and by the suffragettes.
Substituted for this quasi-Tolkien-esque story. Of brave heroes fighting evils and dishing out civilization and freedoms in a benevolent act of manifest destiny.
Such as poor people getting the right to vote or the abolition of child labour.
But largely this is a confection, and it denies most folks who were subsumed by these hegemonic monoliths.
The country that bombed this country, in our grandparents' lifetimes, so theoretically the grandchildren of Nazis can get in and out of England easier than the grandchildren of people from the Commonwealth who fought against the Nazis.
But it doesn't just deny those citizens from the former colonies either.
Prior to about 1670 or so, there was no such thing as the white race, at least not recognized as such, called as such. That is not what people of European descent were when they were in Europe. They were English, they were Irish, they were Scottish, they were whatever they were. They were not white.
Because when I speak about the suffering and wealth generated from the slave trade,
only in the colonies do we become white, and for a very specific reason, because in those early years of the colonial period, where you had white indentured servants, one level above enslaved themselves.
I'm not only speaking about the labor and suffering of black people.
African descended folks, some of them enslaved for life, others indentured servants also in the earliest years of the colonies. Those people would often see their interests as being common. They all realized that they were being screwed over by the same landowners, the same elite.
We must remember, black African slaves weren't transported to the British colonies in the New World until 12 years after the founding of Jamestown. You know, where John Smith meets a 12-year-old Pocahontas. But the first forced or indentured labour.
Indentured servants were the main labor, and if you recall, indentured servants were people who worked for a master for a certain period of time, usually 7 years, and in exchange the plantation owner would pay their passage to America.
Was that of the indigenous population of the UK and other parts of Europe.
An increase in immigration. There's lots of reasons why people want to escape Europe, escape England. They're in debt, it's overcrowded, there's religious Protestant Catholic war stuff going on.
Where a rich planter class.
The offer to any colonist, man, woman, or child that could pay their own passage to America, and they would receive 50 acres of land. This was a great offer, and many Englishmen were eager to
would pay for many hundreds of men who generally wouldn't be able to afford or make their way to the New World otherwise. This was called the headright system.
The headright system, for every ticket that you could afford, you got 50 acres of land. So if you were wealthy, you could come over and get a lot of land. But if you didn't have Momo in the headright system, you'd come over owing.
Though most people didn't volunteer in order to flee the horrendous conditions living hand to mouth here in the UK,
you'd be an indentured servant, and that meant you had to dedicate 5 to 7 years of your life working hard labor before you got some land.
They were either criminals or debtors at first, as the chances of survival in the New World were pretty bleak.
Other problems, there's not enough women. The women who do come over, much fewer than the men, they're going to be marrying the people that are in the Tidewater region, the elite. Why are you going to marry some guy out in the West surrounded by Native Americans with no money?
Potentially would take you up to 4 months to reach there as well. So it really was like stepping into a new world. Literally. They were promised their own lands after they had served their indenturement.
Eventually, they would be free from being under the plantation owners, and you can guess what they wanted when their contract was done. They wanted their land.
But generally, they didn't last or survive these conditions, which led to it being a pretty good deal for the planter class.
These are the elite, these are the powerful, these are the people with Momo. And then the people without Momo, these indentured servants and others that couldn't afford to live there, would get kind of the not so great land out in the West.
As over the decades, they had accumulated mass acres of land. So by the time of the late 1600s, they had become a significant underclass.
But the system is heavily dependent upon indentured servants, and this creates a class system, those with and those without.
Of free, non-landowning men, which history has always proven never ends well. Enter Nathaniel Bacon.
Now Nathaniel isn't really one of them. He's not an indentured servant. He ain't Poe. He ain't Poe.
Who the indentured workers and slaves unified behind.
1874, he arrived in America and purchased a plantation near Jamestown. Bacon came from a prestigious family in England and was related to Sir Francis Bacon, who was a well-known statesman back in England.
You know, deference. To claim lands and expand the colonies, as that was against the interests of the governor of the time, Sir William Berkeley.
While Berkeley abided by the deal he had made with Native Americans years before.
But despite the support of the ruling classes back in Britain,
he had made a deal with area Native American tribes that gave him a large piece of land, which he basically divvied up among some of his friends.
as William Berkeley was one of the king's favourites. Bacon defied and gathered a militia of black and white workers, killed a bunch of Native Americans before storming and burning Jamestown to the ground.
That Bacon is going to replace the colonial governor, that he is going to overthrow the reins of power, and then he gets the poops.
But Nathaniel Bacon died.
Bacon dies of dysentery, and the rebellion goes down in flames.
And the militia lost its leader.
23 of the rebels were hanged, but not Bacon, who...
Gonna die on the toilet. It's a horrible death.
But again, history has proven many times before
to the elite that something needs to be done.
When the pitchforks come out.
Now, we didn't previously mention this, but Bacon was promising freedom to any blacks that joined his cause. And the idea of poor blacks and poor whites uniting is a plantation owner's biggest nightmare.
The ruling classes pay attention, which saw the introduction of some new fancy laws.
But there's always results. So why don't we go take a look at the results right about now?
Which only led to the sowing of seeds of the divisions that have haunt us to this day.
That would be terrible and long-lasting.
But this serves the objectives of the ruling elites the most.
Your power indefinitely, you have to get the consent of the ruled, and this they will do.
As the new laws and classification served as a useful distraction or any subsequent unification of said underclasses.
Is that the headright system and indentured servant system is going to end and be replaced by the African slave system. Now, slaves were in Jamestown since 1619, but they weren't the predominant working labor force. Now they're going to become the predominant working labor force.
1, a shift away from indentured servants to slaves, and 2, a general desire by the English crown to control the...
So much like now,
Prince Philip, the Queen's husband, the Duke of Edinburgh, born Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark, has died at 99 years old.
With the blanket coverage of Prince Philip's death, which, though sad, weren't wholly unpredictable, was it, considering he was 99? But, in my opinion, in a cynical way. This is exactly what the media forces and our government were exactly looking for. With the obvious realities of a Brexit shit show.
Just how dishonest this entire administration has become. And it had to become this dishonest after the referendum result. There was no earthly way that you could deliver a Brexit.
And those unicorns and sunny uplands still pending.
I don't know, maybe that's what he meant by sunlit uplands, is it? Petrol bomb lit streets.
And probably the inconvenient truths of the re-emergence of the Troubles over in Northern Ireland.
Who wrote, Brexit won't hurt Northern Ireland at all. Instead, it will brighten its future. Today, and I thank the producer for this, because Kate Hoey, I discover, has blocked me on Twitter. Today she tweets, the protocol has destabilised Northern Ireland.
The SNP look like making it a full house up north.
And the polling evidence shows that she herself, Nicola Sturgeon, is remarkably popular in Scotland, and that same polling evidence suggests Boris Johnson is not.
With another inevitable referendum on independence. So, let's all engage in the collective sycophantic...
of April, the armed forces will lead a second day of tributes to the Duke of Edinburgh, who died yesterday, aged 99, with gun salutes across the UK, in Gibraltar and from warships at sea.
Mourning of a fringe figure who, let's face it, had some pretty questionable views.
1988 we are now. He was speaking to a German news agency and he said, "In the event that I am reincarnated, I would like to return as a deadly virus to contribute something to solving overpopulation."
So it's important to remember, none of us are really citizens of this country, just subjects of a hereditary bloodline that has subverted the interests of the underclass, despite the fact there's more of us, by installing a few of us as proof of progress.
I became considerably richer than you through honest hard work. You get what you pay for and you earn what you're worth.
Oh, that's one of Stanley's little sayings, that is.
when in fact it's pure collusion. So remember, the ruling classes in every age have tried to impose a false view of the world upon us, so they can get us to tap our toes and goose step to their circus and its anthems.
So we have structural forms of privilege and bias that are much more insidious and much more difficult to overcome. The reaction to Africans and Asians coming here post-World War II, to rebuild the country after the Queen's German cousins bombed it.
Break it down!